the beginning of a nightmare. The late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the cracked pavement of Maplewood Avenue. The heat hung thick in the air, wrapping itself around everything it touched. The distant hum of the city seemed far removed from this aging neighborhood, where time had slowly chipped away at the past, replacing it with something colder, something unrecognizable. Eleanor Hughes, a woman of quiet strength, stepped onto her porch, gripping the chipped wooden railing. Her knees ached, a dull, familiar pain that had settled into her bones over the years. It was just another reminder that time moved forward, whether she was ready for it or not. She adjusted the wide-brimmed straw hat shielding her from the sun and took a deep breath. Across the street, towering high-rises loomed where modest homes once stood. The neighborhood had changed. The old families, the ones she had known for decades, were gone, replaced by younger, wealthier newcomers who walked these streets with easy entitlement, their eyes passing over her like she wasn't even there. But Eleanor had been here for almost 50 years. She had built a life on this street, raised a son, buried a husband, taught generations of children at the local elementary school, attended Sunday service at St. Luke's Church every week, rain or shine. This place was in her bones. And yet, there were moments like today when it felt like none of it mattered, like the world had moved on without her. But today was simple. She had one errand: milk and bread from Cooper's Market. She reached into the pocket of her light cotton dress and ran her fingers over the neatly folded $10 bill tucked inside. That was all she needed, a mother's quiet pride. As Eleanor walked down the sidewalk, her thoughts drifted to her son, Nathaniel Hughes. Once, he had been the little boy who burst through the front door after school, eager to share every detail of his day. Later, he became the fierce young debater who stayed up late at the kitchen table, refining his arguments with unshakable determination. Now, Nathaniel was one of the most powerful men in the country, the United States Attorney General, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the nation, a man who commanded courtrooms, shaped policies, and stood as the guardian of justice. Yet, despite his success, Eleanor sometimes wondered, did he remember what it felt like to be powerless? He called when he could, sent flowers on Mother's Day, expensive scarves at Christmas, always loving, always respectful, but also always busy. Too busy for long talks, too busy for visits, too busy to notice the loneliness that had crept into her evenings. But not today. Today was just an errand, nothing more. She moved steadily down the sidewalk, gripping her purse, not out of fear, but out of habit. These streets weren't the same as they once were. The old diners and hardware stores had disappeared, replaced by sleek storefronts, minimalist cafes, and overpriced espresso bars. Young professionals sat under trendy umbrellas, lost in their laptops, their conversations, their own little worlds. They barely glanced up as she passed. Eleanor sighed. Today wasn't a day for regrets. A routine trip turns into a nightmare. The bell above the market's door chimed softly as Eleanor stepped inside. A rush of cool air wrapped around her, a small but welcome relief from the heat. Just in and out, she reminded herself. Milk, then bread. Simple. The store had a rhythm of its own. The hum of refrigeration units, the quiet beeping of the register, the murmur of distant conversations. A familiar, predictable environment. She moved toward the dairy aisle, her fingers trailing lightly along the glass door before reaching for a half-gallon of milk. The cold seeped through her skin, refreshing, grounding. Then something caught her eye. A young man, no older than 20, moved quickly through the store. Hood up, head down. His hands darted across the shelves with practiced ease, slipping snack bars into his pockets without hesitation. Eleanor's heart tightened. She had been a teacher long enough to recognize desperation when she saw it. Before she could say anything, he pivoted sharply toward the exit. Then, beep, beep, beep. The alarm shattered the store's quiet hum, blaring loud and unforgiving. For a split second, everything froze. Then he bolted. The thief shoved his way out the door, disappearing into the bright afternoon. Gone. The store was silent. Then, a voice. You! Stop right there. Accused without evidence. Eleanor flinched, her pulse suddenly pounding. She turned slowly toward the sound of the voice. A man in a navy polo, badge glinting on his belt, strode toward her with cold precision. An off-duty police officer, his sharp, unwavering stare locked onto her. You, he repeated, his voice low but unyielding. Hands where I can see them. Eleanor's heart stuttered. I don't understand, she stammered. The officer closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Before she could react, his hand clamped around her wrist. Don't play dumb. Empty your pockets. A flicker of disbelief flashed through Eleanor's mind. I haven't even paid yet, she said, lifting her shopping basket. The alarm went off, he countered. And you were standing right here. Panic surged through her. She turned desperately toward the counter. Thomas, the store owner, Thomas Carter, stood behind the register. A man she had known for decades. A man she had trusted. Tell him, she pleaded. Tell him you saw me. I didn't take anything. For a moment Thomas met her gaze. Then, hesitation flickered across his face. He looked away. I didn't see, he said quietly. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Betrayal, humiliation, and then cold steel snapped shut around her wrists. The handcuffs bit into her skin. She gasped. The store tilted. She nearly buckled under the weight of it. Her breath came fast, shallow. The heat outside had been unbearable. But this was worse. This was suffocating. Injustice unfolds. A silent ride to the unknown. The squad car's interior smelled of old leather and sweat. The air conditioning blasted through the vents, but Eleanor Hughes felt none of it. Her wrists throbbed, the metal handcuffs biting into her thin skin. The officer sat stone-faced in the front seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel as they moved through the streets of a city that no longer felt like home. She hadn't stolen anything. She knew it. God knew it. But none of that mattered. Her hands rested limply in her lap. The weight of humiliation pressed against her chest, heavier than the heat outside. She had taught thousands of children in this city, helped struggling students find their confidence, watched this neighborhood transform over decades. And now, she was just another nameless suspect, lost in the machine. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her whole life believing in justice. But in this moment, she understood justice wasn't about truth. It was about power. And right now, she had none. The police station. The car came to an abrupt stop outside the precinct. The officer opened the door and pulled her out. Not roughly, but with indifference. Inside, the police station buzzed with activity. Officers came and went, files in hand, radios crackling with incoming reports. No one paid her any attention. She wasn't the first old black woman to sit in these halls, and she wouldn't be the last. She was fingerprinted, photographed, processed, like any common criminal. Shoplifting, they said. They didn't check the security footage. They didn't ask for a statement. They had already made up their minds. She was placed in a holding cell, a small, gray-walled room with a single bench. The cold metal seat made her bones ache. Across from her sat a young woman, barely in her 20s, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Their eyes met. They got you too? The woman asked after a long silence. Eleanor nodded faintly. Seems that way. What for? Eleanor swallowed. Milk and bread. The young woman let out a bitter laugh. Granola bar, she said. For my daughter. A familiar ache settled in Eleanor's chest. Different faces, different ages, different circumstances, but the same story. The system didn't care about innocence. It never had. A call that changed everything. When they finally called her name, Eleanor hesitated. She had been given one phone call. For a moment, she thought about not calling Nathaniel. He was busy. He had enough on his plate, running investigations, prosecuting criminals, fighting for justice in Washington, D.C. But as she sat in that cold holding cell, realizing that no one else would speak for her, she dialed the number. Mama! His voice was sharp, alert, worried. Eleanor closed her eyes, the weight of the night finally hitting her. "Baby," she whispered, "I need you." The courtroom showdown. The next morning, Eleanor was escorted into the courtroom. It was a small municipal hearing, one of hundreds held every day across the country. Nothing special. To them, she was just another case. Judge Raymond Bishop sat behind the bench, his gaze distant, bored, as if this was just another routine case in his career. The prosecutor, a young, overconfident man, stood and began speaking. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. The defendant was caught at the scene, and the store owner did not witness any other suspects. Given the circumstances, we believe a guilty plea is appropriate." Then the doors swung open. A murmur spread through the courtroom as a tall, broad-shouldered man entered. His impeccable navy suit was sharp. His presence was commanding. His expression, unyielding. Nathaniel Hughes, the United States Attorney General. He strode down the aisle, all eyes on him, and took a seat behind the defense attorney. The judge blinked, suddenly much more interested in the case before him. Nathaniel stood up. "I want to see the footage," he said. The prosecutor stammered. There is no footage, Your Honor. The security cameras malfunctioned that day." Nathaniel's gaze hardened. "That's a lie." A ripple of tension spread through the courtroom. The judge shifted in his seat. Nathaniel turned, his voice cold and precise. "I already had my office pull the footage from Cooper's Market surveillance system. The store's security cameras were operational. There is video evidence. And it exonerates my mother." A beat of silence. Then, Nathaniel motioned toward the court clerk. "Play the footage." The truth revealed. The courtroom fell completely silent as the screen lit up. The footage showed Eleanor shopping, minding her own business. The real thief slipping past her, stuffing items into his pockets. The alarm going off, but Eleanor never leaving the aisle. The officer turning toward Eleanor instead of chasing the real criminal. The truth was undeniable. She had been profiled, targeted, falsely accused. When the video ended, a heavy silence filled the room. Judge Bishop cleared his throat, his face visibly paler than before. Case dismissed. Eleanor stood slowly, her legs shaky beneath her. She turned to the judge. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room. "If my son weren't who he is," she said, "would justice have stood by me today?" The judge didn't answer. Justice, but not for everyone. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Nathaniel. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust forward. "Mr. Hughes, how do you respond to the racial profiling of your mother? Do you think this happens to others who don't have a U.S. Attorney General as a son? Will you be taking legal action?" Nathaniel ignored them all. His only concern was his mother. As he guided her past the crowd, his voice was low, steady. "Mama, I won't let this happen to anyone else." Eleanor looked up at her son. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The fight for justice. Home but forever changed. The ride home was silent. Nathaniel sat beside his mother in the back seat, his hands clenched into fists. His mind raced with fury. This wasn't just about Eleanor. How many others had sat in that holding cell? How many had their names dragged through the system, labeled criminals when they were innocent? How many had been silenced simply because they had no one powerful enough to speak for them? Eleanor, however, remained calm. She had seen too much in her lifetime to be surprised. When they arrived at her modest home, she exhaled, stepping onto the porch she had known for decades. She expected the comfort of familiarity, but everything felt different now. The world had changed. Or maybe it had always been this way. She lowered herself into her usual chair by the window, watching the city move on as if nothing had happened. But everything had, and she knew her son would not let this go. Nathaniel's war against the system. The next morning, Nathaniel Hughes stood at a podium in Washington, D.C. Cameras flashed. Reporters murmured. The entire country was watching. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice steady but filled with controlled fury. "Yesterday my mother, an elderly woman who spent her life as a teacher, as a mother, as a believer in justice, was falsely accused of shoplifting. Not because there was evidence against her. Not because she did anything wrong. But because of racial profiling. The room fell silent. This is not an isolated incident. This happens every day to people without power, without resources, without a voice. And that ends today. A flurry of questions exploded from the press. Mr. Hughes, will you push for new policies? Do you believe this case proves systemic racism? How will you respond legally? Nathaniel looked into the cameras. We will be launching a full federal investigation into racial profiling in law enforcement. Officers who target individuals based on race rather than evidence will be held accountable. No more silence. No more looking away. We will bring justice to those who have been denied it. The message was clear. He wasn't just fighting for his mother. He was fighting for every single person the system had failed. The ripple effect. The case sparked a national conversation. Social media exploded. News stations debated the implications. Activists took to the streets. Justice shouldn't depend on who you know. What if this happened to my mother? How many innocent people are in jail right now because they didn't have a U.S. Attorney General as their son? The store, Cooper's Market, faced intense backlash. Customers boycotted. The owner, Thomas Carter, issued a weak statement. We regret the misunderstanding. But it wasn't enough. Business plummeted. People no longer saw a small neighborhood store. They saw a symbol of complicity. And soon enough, it shut down for good. The officer's fate. The officer who arrested Eleanor faced an internal investigation. The footage was undeniable. He had ignored the real suspect and targeted an innocent woman. Under immense pressure, the department suspended him indefinitely. But for Eleanor, that wasn't enough. He will get another job, she told Nathaniel. He will keep his badge. He will do this to someone else. And next time, they may not have someone to save them. Nathaniel nodded, his jaw set. Then we make sure there is a next time for no one. Justice beyond one case. Nathaniel's investigation unearthed thousands of cases just like Eleanor's. People wrongly accused because they fit the description. Surveillance footage ignored when it contradicted an officer's claim. Young black men arrested for looking suspicious. Mothers criminalized for stealing diapers and food for their children. Each case told the same story. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. But now Nathaniel had the power to change it. Eleanor's reflection. One evening, as the chaos around the case settled, Eleanor sat with Nathaniel on her porch. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the city. You're doing something good, Nathaniel. He looked at her, exhaustion in his eyes. I hope so, she smiled. You are. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Eleanor spoke the words that had haunted her since that day in court. If you hadn't been who you are, what would have happened to me? Nathaniel didn't answer, because he already knew. The final message. Eleanor's case was dismissed. But justice wasn't served, not for everyone. This wasn't just one story. It was thousands. And unless we demand change, it will keep happening. So ask yourself, who has power in our justice system? Who is protected? Who is ignored? How many voices are unheard? Because Eleanor Hughes was lucky. But justice should never depend on luck. What can you do? If the story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this message. Speak up against injustice. Support organizations fighting for equal rights. Justice is only real if it is for everyone. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.